Thank you. Sir, you can go ahead.
Good evening to all of you. Thank you, Balasubramanian, for introducing me. I thank BFS Legal for giving me this opportunity. In a span of possibly 45 minutes and a little more, I will be talking to you on the legacy and heritage of the Madras High Court. So what is the difference between legacy and heritage? Well, if you look at the dictionary, both terms are used synonymous as synonyms. But for the purpose of this talk, legacy is the legal system which the British left us. My reference when I say legacy would be to the British, the legal system which they left us. And the heritage would be the traditions and values which we inherited from that system. It all began when the price of paper went up by £1 in England. So a group of merchants petitioned Queen Elizabeth, of course the great-great-grandmother of the present Queen, and asked for a charter to trade directly with India. Because till then that the Dutch had a stranglehold over the trade of spices from India. And therefore they said, please give us permission to set up the East India Company, as they called it, and to trade directly with India. So Queen Elizabeth, on a day which will become history, 31st December 1600, granted the British merchants the right to trade with India. So from then on started our legacy, the legacy which they imparted to us. It is not as if we did not have an advanced legal system earlier. If you are interested, you can go into YouTube and Google my name. I have delivered a lecture on the history of our ancient legal system, and there you will find that we will. It is not as if the country did not have an advanced legal system. We had extremely advanced legal system, but the British sort of unified the various existing systems that we had and brought it all into a common strand. This, if you ask me, was their contribution to our judicial system. So in 1600, what I am now was the first milestone. The first milestone in this voyage, which then led to the legacy that we are going to be talking about. So what I'm going to do, this legacy and heritage of the Indian judicial system is a huge canvas for me to paint. So what I have done is, I have identified 15 milestones in this journey. And in this brief time of 45 minutes to an hour, I shall be talking to you about those 15 milestones which I consider to be significant in this journey which the Madras High Court has traced. So 1600, it all started with the charter by Queen Elizabeth. And after that, the significant date is August 22nd, 1639, when Fort St. George came to be established here in Madras. It was largely on account of two factors, as they were called. Agents were called factors in those days. And it was largely due to the efforts of Francis Day and Andrew Cohen, two factors at the factory at Musulipatnam, where they felt that the quality of cloth was not as superior as the one they got here at Madras. Therefore, these two gentlemen were on the lookout for leasing a strip of land somewhere close to this part of the Coromandel coast. And they got in touch with the Raja of Chandragiri, who then granted them this lease of a strip of land about 3 miles long and about 2 miles wide. And from there started this journey. We hardly have any institutions in their memory today. It is also a moot question as to whether Madras, so to say, started from that time, because the firman is equal to a GO. The charter is also equivalent to a present day GO. The firman that was granted by the Raja of Chandragiri to Francis Day and Andrew Cohen said that you are permitted to set up Fort St. George in Madras Patnam. Therefore, there is a misconception that Madras Patnam is a colonial name, or that Madras was a name given to us by the British. It is not a name given to us by the British. Because if it were so, the firman that is granted would not say that you are permitted to set up Fort St. George in Madras, Patna. That's evidence number one. The second evidence is in 2012, 2013, some epigraphists are people who make a study of engravings in stone, have been able to show that from 9th century AD, there has been a fort called Madras Patna in that part of the country. Therefore, this even trying to change the name from Madras to Chennai was, in my opinion at least, a very inconceivable move, because the original name of this part, of this port, so to say, was in fact Madras right from the beginning. And Madras is etymologically, the root of that is Madras, Madurai, Madurantakam. The root is Maduram. That is a place which was as sweet as honey, where people were as sweet as honey. So, therefore, Madras was quite an appropriate name, and it had a root in our Indian language, and therefore it is not quite right to say that Madras was a name given to us by the British. Anyways, Fort St. George came to be established in Madras, Vietnam, and once when the British came here, they had no territorial ambitions at all. They came in here only as merchants. Later, they were, I would say, conveniently pushed into territorial acquisitions and became an imperial power. As one famous writer said, East India Company became a state in the guise of a merchant. That's how it was described. A state in the guise of a merchant. So, East India Company set up Fort St. George, and as soon as they set up Fort St. George, there is a settlement that grew around it, which was called the White Town. Actually, White Town, it was called White Town because there was a rule which Fort St. George brought into effect, which said that all houses which the Europeans had in that settlement should be painted white. And therefore, it came to be called White Town. And then there is a settlement of Indian weavers largely, because the purpose of the British was to attract the weaving community. And there was a settlement that came up around Fort St. George, and that became the Black Town as a contradiction to White Town. So it is not, as is commonly thought, it is called White Town because white men lived there, called Black Town because black men lived there. No, it wasn't that. And interestingly, many of the settlements around Fort St. George were for people who belonged to the weaving community. And they gave those places the name. For example, Chindadaripet is Chinnatharipettai. So that is an indication of the type of quality of cloth that was available in the area, and the weavers who concentrated on their trade and helped to build the formidable center of trade in cloth. So this then is the second milestone. The third milestone is the establishment of the Madras Corporation. Interestingly, Madras Corporation was established in 1688 actually on 29 September 1688 to sort of put a check on the powers of the Elihu Ale, who was then the governor of Madras. Elihu Ale was the governor of Madras, and he was an extremely formidable person. He exercised a lot of power. He was very, very autocratic in his disposition. He ensured that he made a lot of money for himself, which was a common thread that ran through many of the officers of the East India Company. You will be interested to know that one of the first Indian words that went into the English dictionary was the word loot, right? Loot is actually, it has its etymological origins in India, and it went into the English dictionary. And likewise, Elihu Ale looted Madras, and therefore, to give a check to his powers, the Corporation of Madras was constituted through the Charter of the Queen, which was a year earlier in 1687. And the Corporation of Madras was the second oldest corporation next to the Corporation of London in any part of the British Commonwealth. So in 1688, it came to be constituted, and the major functionaries of the Corporation of Madras were the mayor and his aldermen. So initially, the mayor and 12 of his aldermen constituted the first judicial body that Madras had ever seen in terms of British legacy. So from there started this business, and when this came into existence, originally they had jurisdiction only amongst the Europeans, and unless any of the natives wanted to voluntarily submit their disputes to the mayor and his aldermen, the mayor and the aldermen, through the provisions of the charter, could not exercise any power over them. So this then is the third milestone in the evolution of the legal history of Madras. The fourth milestone was, as the settlement grew and as more and more business was generated from Madras, which made the East India Company extremely rich, which made the officers of East India Company extremely rich. As I said, LQAL plundered a large amount of money. The British government then sent a bunch of commissioners here to examine and to do an investigation on the misdeeds of LQAL. He very conveniently bribed them also, and then was able to leave for England with all this huge wealth. And then he got a letter from America from a bunch of people who were interested in holding it, starting a university in the USA, and then he funded that university, and thus came into existence Yale University. So Yale University in America was funded from the loot that LUAL had made in India. So that was the origin of that university. And LQAL was also a slave trade. Many of these British officers were also slave traders. And therefore, even today, there is a move in Yale University to change the name of the university, but that's not happening. But there's a bit of a resentment even in America that the university was started with the proceeds from sale of slaves. Then the fourth milestone is the Charter of the Queen, once again of King George I, which was passed in 24th September 1726, which reduced the number of judicial authorities amongst the mayor and aldermen from 12 to 9, and it also started creating courts which will hear criminal matters, because with trade will come crime. So crime also increased, and therefore you needed the body which will administer that or determine cases that came in the White Town, and therefore the mayor and aldermen were also given powers to determine these cases, and that would be the fourth major milestone that which we come across in the evolution of the legal history at Madras. The fifth is the once again a charter which was passed in 1753, which once again redefined the powers of these various authorities, and for the first time, court called the Court of Request was established. This Court of Request is equal to our small causes court, and where a claim did not exceed 15 rupees or its equivalent in pagodas, as they used to call the currencies in those days, a Court of Request was established. So there is one other incident which I should tell you between 1746 and 1749, and before this Charter of 1753 was passed, which is the invasion of Madras by Dupleix. Dupleix had a French settlement, as you know, in Pondicherry, and then he decided to invade Madras and to take over Madras. And when he attacked Madras, it was almost like a cakewalk for him. Of course, Robert Clive escaped, and then he went to Cuddalore, where he set up Fort St. David, and then he recouped and came back and once again captured Madras, and ultimately through a treaty, which is called the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. By that time, the British had conquered Nova Scotia in Canada and were holding it hostage. And therefore, by that treaty, the British gave Nova Scotia back to the French, and the French gave Madras back to the British. Otherwise, possibly we would have been a French colony, and I would have been giving this lecture to you in the French language. So that is what happened between 1746 to 1749. Interestingly, after this war happened, the British did a bit of retrospect, in thinking in retrospect, and trying to analyze why they lost this war. They decided that they lost this war because around the White Town was this Black Town, which was a cluster. So they decided that anybody who comes from the sea and attacks us, we will not be able to retaliate very quickly. And therefore, they decided that they must dismantle this black town which has come around the White House, which they proceeded to do. They dismantled this entire structure and created what is called an esplanade. An esplanade is a large open space. It is a bit comical that we still retain the name in Paris Corner called Esplanade, when we can see no large open space at all. But Esplanade is the name given to a large open space. And from Fort St. George till the Georgetown, as it was called, it was a large open space. While they pushed all the settlements out and took them to Georgetown, there were two temples there which caused a problem. One is the Keshava Perumal temple, and the other is the Malleshwara temple. It is very easy to dislodge houses, isn't it? You can dislodge houses, especially when you have control over the area. You can pass an order and say that all these houses have to be demolished, and we will help you to put up constructions elsewhere. But what do you do about temples? I mean, there is a lot of sentiment attached to temples. But strangely, overnight and almost simultaneously, both temples caught fire. And the British then came very quickly and said, "Oh God, this is a tragedy, but we will help you to meet it. We will take these two temples and relocate them in Georgetown." And therefore, these two temples were relocated in Georgetown. And even today, the historians suspect that the British were behind these two temples catching fire. So these two temples which caught fire were relocated to Georgetown and the place around Georgetown, and that is where they still are. There is still a Keshava Perumal temple, and there is still a Malleshwara temple. For a long time, the temples maintained the link with the justice system, because when the witnesses got into the box, if you were a Hindu, you would have to swear on the Gita and on the water of Ganges and Tulsi leaves. And the water from Ganges and Tulsi leaves used to be brought by a priest from these temples till that system was abandoned in the late 19th century. So this is how the temple still built, but maintained their links with the justice system. So in 1753, you had this other charter, which once again realigned the manner in which justice came to be rendered in Madras, which is again a very, very significant. Importantly, it also established the first full-fledged judicial system, which took care of a court of request for small causes. Then you had civil claims, and for the first time, right was given to even sue the company, which is the East India Company. You had a full-fledged criminal system. All this came to be established in the three presidencies of Calcutta, of Madras, and Bombay through this single document, which is the Charter of 1753. In our Madras Museum, we have the original of this document. Bombay and Calcutta have been asking us, have been requesting us that we must keep this document in rotation, that once a year each court must have this original document, but we have refused because this document is very valuable and can't be moved around like that. So the 1753 Charter is still with us, and it is in display in the museum at Madras. Now, from 1753, I will have to shift the scene of action to Calcutta, because till this time, Madras was the primordial center of British rule in India. But 1773 brought about a change through the regulation of 1773, because by this time, the fortunes of East India Company started going down. Officially, East India Company said that I am in trouble because the price of tea and my trade of tea with America has been badly affected. We are not able to send tea to America, and therefore we've lost money. While in truth, it was that the officers of East India Company were plundering India. Not only India, they were plundering East India Company itself. It was a strange situation when the company's fortunes were sinking and the fortunes of the officers of the company was rising. Anyway, the long and short of it is, the East India Company had to petition the British government for financial aid, and the British government therefore gave them money. And in 1773, therefore, the British Crown said we need to regulate the functioning of the East India Company, and thus came the Regulation Act of 1773. The Regulation Act of 1773 is important as a legal milestone for Madras, because for the first time it established the Supreme Court at Calcutta. So why must this be important for Madras? Because the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court of Calcutta was over Madras and Bombay also. So therefore, the judicial control of the courts at Madras came to be reposed at the Supreme Court at Calcutta. But it actually turned out to be a very, very bad idea because the Supreme Court of Calcutta came to be manned by judges who were imported from England, who had absolutely no concept of the way in which India functioned, of how its traditions function, of how its society function, of how its trade function, of how its commerce function. Therefore, they completely went berserk and they took on themselves a position as being antagonistic to the officers of the East India Company. And the East India Company found that many of its orders were set aside by the Supreme Court at Calcutta, and that in turn affected its fortunes in India. And you would have also heard of the very famous Nandakumar case, the Khasiraju case, and also the impeachment of Elia Impey, who was the Chief Justice of the Calcutta High Court, on charges that he was acting against imperial ambitions. So this was the fate of that 1773 regulation. It did not turn out to be a bright idea. The Supreme Court was completely berserk and went completely berserk. And when questioned, it said, I draw my authority directly from the crown. I am not beholden to the company. I do not care if your company has problems here, and therefore I will do whatever I want to do. So any attempt by the company to collect revenue, any attempt by the company to sort of deal with its acquisitions in India were met with strong resistance by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court and company came to be completely at loggerheads. Therefore, the company petitioned the crown and said, yes, we understand we owe you money, but this is not the way to go about it. You have sent us a bunch of judges who don't understand this country at all. They are, ruling this country on the basis of English principles of justice, which this country is not accustomed to. And also, this is affecting the fortunes of East India Company. If we don't make money, how do we send you money? How do we defray the expenses of the loan that we have taken from you? So please rein in the Supreme Court of Calcutta. So that petition worked because ultimately the British Crown is also only interested in its financial fortunes. It was not interested in ensuring that the people of India got any great justice. So then came the regulations of 1881. The regulations of 1781, also it is called the Act of Settlement, which reined in the Supreme Court at Calcutta and said that the Supreme Court at Calcutta will no longer have powers over Madras and Bombay. It also made the Governor General, Warren Hastings was the first Governor General of India. Thereafter, the chiefs who came, English chiefs who came, were called the Viceroys. The first Governor General of India, Warren Hastings, was given powers to manage the affairs of the East India Company without any interference by the Supreme Court. So that is the next phase, and that is why the Settlement Act of 1881 is important, because it restored to Madras the power to conduct its own judicial duties without any interference from Calcutta. But this did not change the manner in which justice was rendered in Madras. It continued to be pathetic because once again it was the mayor and aldermen who were regulating this, and many times the mayor and aldermen had financial interest in matters that were coming up before them. So they were actually interested parties in many of the litigations that came up before. So this state of affairs once again caused a lot of unhappiness to the British Crown, and therefore they decided there has to be restructuring in the other presidencies. And then came this wonderful man who was got here, Sir Thomas Strange. A large portrait of him adorns the court of the Chief Justice at Madras High Court, and he was sent to rather set right things. Originally, when he came to Madras, Sir Thomas Strange decided that possibly it is good to have a recorder's court here at Madras, which is a smaller version of the Supreme Court. But then down the line, he felt that that's not a very bright idea. And hardly 2 years after, he recommended to the British Crown for the establishment of the Supreme Court at Madras. Much of what we have, much of the foundation for the British legal system, much of the traditions and values that we have in the court system today were all laid by Sir Thomas Strange, and that's why you have a portrait of him adorning the court of the Chief Justice of the Madras. So Sir Thomas Strange did two things. He completely cleaned up the judiciary. Not only cleaned up the judiciary, but he also cleaned up the officers who were associated with the judiciary. And one of the first targets of this cleaning up exercise was the registrar of the Madras High Court, a gentleman called Gilbert Ricketts. Now, Gilbert Ricketts had become astoundingly wealthy. And when Sir John Newbold, who was the second or third judge of the Supreme Court, was invited by Rickett Gilbert, to his house for dinner, and he lived in the place where the governor of Madras currently lives. John Newbold was completely astounded by his affluence. He was doing it in a grand style, and in his stables were some of the costliest horses that any Englishman can own. So all these raised a suspicion in the mind of John Newbold, and he went back to Sir Thomas Strange and told him that we need to do an inquiry about this man's fortune. Something is very, very hanky-panky. So Sir Thomas Strange constituted a committee to go into why and how Rickett Gilbert is so extremely wealthy. The salary of most of these officers was pretty good. I'm not saying no, but that still didn't account for the lavish lifestyle he lived. So therefore, they constituted an inquiry to look into Gilbert's wealth, so to say. And when they found and Gilbert, appeared for this investigation. He prepared all the papers. Then, as he just walked towards the podium to submit it, he dropped out dead. So, that sent a shiver down the spine of unscrupulous people who were manning the judiciary, and they all fell into line. And therefore, Sir Thomas Strange, from 1800 to 1862, he laid the foundation for one of the most glorious institutions, which is the Supreme Court at Madras. After he, there is, when people write about the history of the Madras High Court, they always say that the first book on Hindu law was by John May. That's wrong. The first book on Hindu law was by Sir Thomas Strange. He was so interested in the manner in which Hindus, Muslims, other communities resolve their difficulties and their problems that he actually wrote a book on Hindu law, which was the first publication. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Madras for 17 years. And then he went back to England and lived for another 13, 14 years and then died. So he laid the foundation for much of the glory of what is our current legal system. Then the next important date, I would say to my mind, is 1859, in which year C.V. Ranganatha Sastry was appointed as a judge of the Small Causes Court of Madras. So he's an unsung hero of Madras. Everybody talks about Mutsami and everybody talks about Bashi Iyengar, but unfortunately nobody is today even remembers Ranganatha Sastry, his great-great-grandson, if it's Justice C.V. Karthikeyan. He was a phenomenal man. He was first an interpreter in the High Court, and he knew 16 languages. Mind you, 16 languages he learned in those years. And when there is an opportunity to appoint an Indian to the post of a judicial officer, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Rawlinson, took the initiative to appoint him as a judge of the Small Causes Court. So, in fact, he is the first Indian to occupy a responsible judicial post in the British hierarchy. Interestingly, Chief Justice Rawlinson was also the first Vice Chancellor of the Madras University, and Madras University and the High Court have had a long and very fruitful association when many of the judges of the Madras High Court were appointed as Vice Chancellors, and they discharge their functions in exemplary manner. So that I would say 1859 marks the advent of recognition of Indian talent to the judiciary in the British hierarchy. And then, of course, came 1862. You would all know that after the British mutiny, the Sepoy mutiny in 1857, the British Crown directly took over the administration of India. And subsequently, in about 20 years later, the East India Company itself came to be dissolved. So, as soon as the Madras High Court was established in 1862, its first Chief Justice, Sir Colley Harman Scotland, did certain things which put the Vakils of the Madras High Court in a much better situation and to a greater advantages than the counterparts in Bombay and Calcutta. And the first thing that he did is he enrolled an Indian Vakil as a judge of the High Court. The first Vakil to be so enrolled as a Vakil of the High Court was a gentleman called T. Raja Ramarao. I managed to get his photo, and a photo is displayed in the Madras High Court Museum. Please take a look at it when you go to the Madras Museum. He was the first Vakil, the first legal practitioner. The barristers were very unhappy when he did that because they felt they should not allow Indian talent to grow. And therefore, they all assembled and decided that they would go to the court of Sir. In those days, Vakils used to, for a long time thereafter, Vakils used to be enrolled, or advocates used to be enrolled. Even my senior, Mr. Govind Swaminathan, was enrolled before the Chief Justice of the High Court, because that was at that time, till the Advocates Act came into effect in 1861, the legal profession was completely in control of the judges, and it was the judges who would enroll Vakils, and he was enrolled by Scotland. So when the barristers wanted to protest, they decided to go to this court and register their courts. But Scotland came to know about this, and he sat a few minutes earlier, called Ramarao, enrolled him as an advocate. And when the barristers marched in, he said, "I'm sorry, the deed is done. If you have any complaints to make, go to England and write to the Lord Chancellor." So nothing came out of that, and Ramarao is even today revered as the first Vakil who was enrolled in the Madras. So after that, of course, the most important date would be 1879, when Justice T. Muthuswami Iyer came to be appointed, the first Indian in Madras Presidency. Because in Calcutta there was another judge who had been appointed, an Indian who had been appointed as a judge of the Calcutta High Court. So the first Indian in Madras Presidency to be appointed as a judge of the High Court was Justice T. Muthuswami. Justice Holloway was put in charge of identifying names to be suggested. The British Lord Chancellor told him to identify 3 names who could be recommended, 3 Indian names who could be recommended for being made a judge of the High Court, of which the Lord Chancellor was to select one. Holloway wrote thrice, T. Muthuswami, T. Muthuswami, T. Muthuswami. He couldn't think of a second name at all. So that's how, and he held this position with great distinction and rose to high levels of eminence, and he was also knighted by the British Crown. He also, for a brief time, was the acting Chief Justice of the Madras. Interestingly, when he passed away, the British Parliament rose for a minute to pay homage to this great Indian jurist. That is the level of attainment which he attained, starting from very, very humble beginnings, where he could not, his family could not even buy oil to light a lamp for him to sit and study. From that level, and that level to reach a level where the British Parliament stood for a minute in silence, acknowledging his genius, is absolutely a fantastic path to trace. Now, after Justice Muthuswami, immediately after that, Arthur Collins, who was his very, very great fan, decided that he will have a statue of Justice Muthuswami in the premises, and therefore came to be installed that statue which you see in the High Court. And the sculptor of that statue is the sculptor of the royalty in England. That is the extent to which Sir Arthur Collins, you know, stood in awe and admiration of Muthuswami. So that was in 1879. The next important date is, of course, the inauguration of the High Court buildings in 1892. It was the handiwork of two geniuses, Henry Irwin and Nambarumal Shetty, which resulted for the first time in a court complex which applied the Indo-Saracenic art of architecture. The first time, because both Calcutta and Bombay High Court are what are called Western Gothic decors. They are not Indo-Saracenic architecture. The first time Indo-Saracenic architecture itself came to be applied was in the Chepauk Palace, and that was by this, once again, a maverick but a genius, an architect called Paul Ben. In 1892. I understand that I'm just giving you a bird's view of how we progressed from 1600 to 1947. I'm not going to go beyond 1947. And within this period, what are the 15 important landmarks? So after 1892, the next important landmark is 1897, when Bashim Iyengar came to be. This is the first time, once again, an Indian. When I'm talking about Indian, you must understand, I am talking about an India which included Pakistan and Bangladesh. That is the expanse of the Indian territory that I am referring to. And for the first time, once again, in India, Bashim Iyengar was appointed as an acting Advocate General of the Madras. And the barristers at that time, including, strangely, Early Norton. Early Norton was a great supporter of the Indian freedom movement. He was a great supporter of the rise of Indian Vakils. He was a great friend of the Indian Vakils. But even he could not stomach the fact that an Indian was going to be appointed as an Advocate General. And all of them protested to the Lord Chancellor, but Lord Chancellor said nothing doing. These are people of astounding merit, and we will not overlook these people just on the ground that they happen to be Indians. And in 1897, therefore, Bashim Iyengar came to be appointed as the acting Advocate General of Madras. Then, once again, the next milestone will be 1937, when V.L. Ethiraj came to be appointed as the public prosecutor of the Madras. You must remember that the British were all right with Indians being posted as Advocate Generals, because this is a civil post, and they felt that not much damage could be done here, because even if some orders were passed and then it could be taken to the Privy Council, and the Privy Council could set it aside, etc., etc. So there is no great damage that can be done. But they would never repose faith in an Indian to hold the position of a public prosecutor. And it was remarkable that they reposed faith in V.L. Ethiraj for his sense of fairness and his commitment to the rule of law, that they made him an advocate, the public prosecutor of the Madras High Court, when Madras High Court was at its most, the British rule in Madras was at its most tumultuous period. It was at this period that V.L. Ethiraj was appointed. And when V.L. Ethiraj was appointed, he once again made a mark in the history of the Madras High Court, that on the day of his appointment, all the judges of the High Court sat to welcome him. There was only one other person who enjoyed a privilege similar to this, and that was Alladi Krishnamurthy Iyer, who, when he remitted his post as the Advocate General of the Madras High Court, all the judges of the High Court sat together to bid farewell to him. So these two gentlemen were what made Madras High Court very proud. They brought great pride to the Madras High Court, and Madras High Court came to be respected enormously on account of the talents of people like this. Then the last milestone I'll come to is Rajamannar. Rajamannar became a Chief Justice, became a judge of the High Court in 1945, and became a judge, Chief Justice of the High Court in 1948. And from there on, it was a golden period for the Madras High Court till 1967. He was not only a great judge, but his involvement and his mastery over the arts was phenomenal. So much so that after his retirement, he was appointed as the president of the Sahitya Academy, All India president of the Sahitya Academy. And on 2 occasions, he was also governor of Madras and held very positions to great distinction, and he rose to very high levels of eminence. It is only Rajamannar and Chagla who refused an elevation to the Supreme Court because they said, my powers under Article 226 are much wider than the powers of Supreme Courts under Article 332. Supreme Court is only a court of appeals, and my powers are much wider. So why would I want to go to the Supreme Court? They refused to go to the Supreme Court and retired as Chief Justices of their respective courts. So this is a very quick overview, bird's view of the development of the judicial system in Madras, from which you can glean aspects of its legacy and heritage. I'm going to stop with just observing 3 things. Madras High Court, Bombay High Court, Calcutta High Court, and several judicial institutions that functioned during that time are known for their preeminence. Why were we not able to retain that after independence? I'm not saying Madras High Court is no longer an eminent institution. Far from it, we still have much to be proud of. We have pedigree, we have quality, we have hardworking advocates, all that, yes. But there are 3 factors which, to my mind, as a person who has devoted some time to study the growth of these institutions, I would say that there are 3 factors which we must address, which will contribute to the High Court regaining its eminence. The first factor is, if you take 150 years of the Madras High Court, 85 years it was a British court. 85 years to the date, because you see, in 15th August 1962 is when the Madras High Court came to be established. It ceased to be a British court in 1947. So if you take 2012 as the 150 years of the Madras High Court, 15th August 2012, of that 85 years, it functioned as a British court. 65 years, it functioned as an Indian court. For this 85 years, it had only 11 Chief Justices, which means a Chief Justice had close to 7.5 to 8 years on an average. Some of them held a larger term, some of them held shorter terms. Every Chief Justice had nearly 7.5 years to set standards for the institution, pursue those standards, call up people who did not meet the standards, and generally contribute to the growth of the institution. But in the 65 years after we attained independence, we had, from Justice Rajamannar to Justice Iqbal, we had 24 Chief Justices, right? So 24 Chief Justices in 60 years will give you an average of less than 2.5 to 3 years. Now, in that, you detect the period of Rajamannar, you detect the period of Veerasamy, who between them took 20 years. You're really talking about 22 judges in a period of 45 years, which means that each Chief Justice had less than 2 years. Many of them had pathetic terms of 6 months, 8 months, which don't really count to anything. So if you want to look at the good of that person occupying the post, it's good. Somebody retired as Chief Justice of a High Court. But if you want to look at the good of the institution, you must have a Chief Justice who has a fairly long tenure in the judiciary for him to bring about any worthwhile changes to the institution. An institution like the Madras High Court, it will take any Chief Justice a minimum of 2 to 3 years to even understand the institution, to even understand the people associated with the institution, to even understand the traditions of the institution. So by the time he understands all this, he's shifted on, right? So my first observation is that if we are to once again bring all these institutions to the level of eminence and not worry about the terms which the career path of the persons occupying the post, our institutions must have chief justices who on an average must have at least 7 to 9 years as chief justice. That's point one. The second point is that these judges must be paid much better than the current pay. If you look at the salary of the judges of the High Court in 1862, it was 4,000 rupees a month, right? And with that type of money, or even before independence, it was 4,000 rupees a month, right? 4,000 rupees in 1947 is equivalent to many more times than salary that judges are. Why was this possible? This was possible because the ICS officers could not dictate the terms on the basis of which judges would draw their salary. Today, unfortunately, no IAS officer will permit a judge of the High Court or the Supreme Court to draw a salary which is higher than him, right? In some way or other, it will be shot down. I think that is a matter of reform which we need to look at. Thirdly, seniority never counted. When Rajamannar became the Chief Justice of the Madras High Court, he was 6th on the list, but still he was made the Chief Justice of the Madras High Court. And therefore, you need to look at talent and not the person who, the seniority of the person occupying the post. So, of course, you can come up with various norms by which you will determine how a person is meritorious. By all means, do that. Today, if you look at the appointment of vice chancellors, there is a grading. There are several things that go into calculating whether a person is good, the number of papers he has presented, the number of theses he has written, the number of publications in peer journals, his attendance record, his publication record internationally, speeches he has given international. All this is collected, it is calibrated, and the basis of which they decide whether he should be made a vice chancellor, even though he may not have the seniority. It is some rule like that which must be introduced to ensure that seniority is. By all means, consider seniority for all other reasons a person is truly eminent. But I am saying don't place seniority at the forefront. Because of the bad experience that we had with the judiciary during the emergency, we developed a distaste for moving away from seniority, which I think should not be the reason. But there would be a counter argument to that to say that, but then there would be favoritism, nepotism. Get over that by calibrating the standards on the basis of which you will determine merit so that it does not stand merely in the realm of conjectures and nepotism. Therefore, in this few minutes, that I have been given to share my thoughts with you about the development of the legacy and heritage of Madras. I hope I have given you a bird's eye view of the history of this glorious institute. Thank you. Any questions you want me to take? Hello? Hello?
So the questions have been typed in the Zoom group chat. If you can kindly see the questions.
There are some 12 questions. If you can just...
Okay, I will just read out the questions, sir.
Yeah. Just select a few of the important ones. I'll be quite happy.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. One of the question is, what is the root for the name Chennai?
No, root for the name Chennai is, it is named, see, there was an intermediary. When the British came to India, there was an intermediary called Beri Timmappa, right? These were Dubashes. Beri Timmappa was a Dubash. Because being a Dubash, people paid huge amounts of money. All the streets that you see, the Tambuchetti Street, Yerabalu Street, all these people were phenomenally successful Dubashes. So the Dubash who helped Francis Day and Andrew Cohen get a lease of this strip of land was a Dubash called Beri Timmappa. Beni Timmappa, when the British set up this black town, said that you should call that town after my father. His father was Chennappa Nayakar. Therefore, this name has absolutely no historical relevance. It is not even Tamil. I think it is Telugu. So I don't know why, on what basis that Chennai has been brought in as a substitute for Madras. It is Chennai only because Beri Timmappa's father, Chennappa Nayakar, he wanted to, and he contributed a great amount of money for setting up the temple also, and therefore that came to be called as Chennai Kesava Perumal Temple. That's the only reason. There is nothing, of any great national importance. Of importance as heritage to name this city as Chennai. Chennappa Nayakar was not even a great freedom fighter or a great chieftain or a great ruler or a great warrior. Just that he happened to be the father of the Dubash who got the lease of that 3-mile long stretch.
So the next question is the jurisdiction of the Madras High Court. To what extent was it prior to independence?
Yeah, prior to independence, the jurisdiction of the Madras High Court was over the entire Madras Presidency, which means it started from the end of Orissa and stretched up to Kanyakumari, which included substantial parts of what is today Karnataka, substantial parts of what is today Kerala, a good part of what is Orissa, except for the princely states of the Nizam, the Raja of Pudukkottai, which were all governed by their own legal systems. The Madras High Court had jurisdiction over all these areas. That's why, many of the great judges, for example, Krishna Iyer was enrolled in the Madras High Court. Justice Hegde was enrolled in the Madras High Court. So many of the legal luminaries were part of the Madras High Court establishment, and then moved to Subbarao was part of the Madras High Court. So like that, many judges who had on the Supreme Court and held very high positions were all enrolled in the Madras High Court because Madras High Court had jurisdiction over the entire Madras Presidency.
So the next question is, what are the challenges that are being faced in preserving the heritage and legacy of the Madras High Court?
I told you, I ended my speech with giving 3 reasons which are challenges to the preservation of the legacy, heritage and legacy of the Madras High Court. To mind, at least, you must have Chief Justice who have at least 4 to 5 years terms, and then you must select people of outstanding merit. You must not go by seniority alone, and you must pay them stupendously good salary. I think, ultimately, any system is only as good as the person who is running it, right? That is the fact, whichever part of the world you go to. So these are systems where you must show utmost care in selecting a good person and putting him in charge.
So, but what has the Heritage Committee now done, considering the Chief Justices keep coming and going?
No, Heritage Committee's jurisdiction is only to preserve the building, the heritage building of the Madras High Court, and to ensure there are other buildings. There are nearly 92 buildings all over Tamil Nadu which are more than 100 years old, and we also take care of those buildings, and that is the jurisdiction of the Heritage Committee. It is only the bar which can address issues relating to the preservation of the tradition and values of the Madras High Court. The traditions and values of the Madras High Court are not within the preserve of the Heritage Committee of the Madras High Court.
There's a question. What will happen to the Madras Law College building as the college has been shifted?
The Madras Law College building is once again being renovated, but what will be done with it is a matter of discussion still, when we have been sort of interrupted by this current fiasco. We will get back to normal, and then we will take a decision on what is to be done. There is also litigation pending about what must be done to that building. So we have to, in the meantime, I filed a PAL to ensure that this building was preserved, because what had happened is, because they did this metro rail, they had dug up an underground, and we had IIT Madras come and inspect the building, and we found that there are nearly 180 damages which the building had suffered. But so I had filed a PAL, and we got then the metro rail was good enough to come forward and say, we will repair the building for you, which they have done. And then after the repair work has been completed, IIT Madras has inspected. I have also been part of the team which have been inspected the building, and they have certified that all the work has been properly completed. Now we should hand it over to the PWD to once again restore the building and bring it back to its original.
That's about it, sir, with the questions. Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us with the information. I hope everyone benefited from hearing your speech.
Thank you. Thank you.